Little Miss Mouse by Amy Ella Blanchard. Chapter 11. Signed, Simon Petty. It was a week later that Ruth was in her room with Hetty sitting before her on the window seat. The house was very still. Bertie's howls did not cleave the air. The swish, swish of Mrs. Mayfield's silken petticoats was no longer heard. Even Mademoiselle's high-pitched, voluble French did not pierce the silence. "I am very glad they didn't decide to take me, Hetty," said Ruth. "I'd much rather not go. Oh my, isn't it lovely to get rid of Bertie? Don't you feel glad that you don't have to stay down in your cave? Now that I haven't those hateful verbs to learn, I shall have time to sew for you, Hetty. I've hardly dared to more than take you out to look at you for a week. For although Uncle Sidney said I was not to give you up, Bertie would have come and taken you without the asking if you were within reach." Hetty's smiling face seemed response enough to these confidences. "Oh, Hetty," Ruth went on, "I am so glad that Mademoiselle is to be gone 3 whole days. For 3 whole days, we shall have everything to ourselves. I can take you down to the nursery when I have my meals, and it will be so cozy, almost like being at home again. I wonder what they are doing there this minute. I haven't been very lucky yet in finding a whole lot of money to take us back, have I? I wonder when I shall go." That morning, Mrs. Mayfield, in sudden alarm because of a cold Bertie had taken, insisted upon bearing him away to Lakewood for a week, while Mr. Mayfield should be gone upon a business trip. Mademoiselle, feeling that this was a good opportunity to take a holiday, pleaded an ill friend and would be gone for 3 days. "I simply cannot be bothered with 2 children in a hotel," Mrs. Mayfield had said to her husband, "and I don't believe Ruth would care a particle about going." But Ruth's uncle consulted her before he settled the matter. He sought her out and asked, "Do you want to go to Lakewood with your Aunt Lily and Bertie? Or would you rather stay here with the servants and Mademoiselle?" Ruth hesitated for a moment. "I'd much rather stay here," she replied. If what?" asked her uncle. "If Mademoiselle were not going to be here too." Mr. Mayfield laughed. "That's frank, at least. Well, she is not to be here all the time. She is going away for 3 days. I shouldn't wonder if she stretched the time longer, and there will be only Katie to look after you. Mrs. Mayfield will take Minnie with her. The cook and Martin will have the house to see to." "Can you stand a whole week in such company?" "Oh, yes, for I'll have Hetty, you know. I may be back in 2 or 3 days myself. Then I should surely like to stay." "Bless the child," murmured Mr. Mayfield. "I think then, since you do not really care to go, that we will leave you here," he added. It was certainly an easy way to arrange affairs, for Katie was steady and conscientious. She could be relied upon to take good care of the little girl, and Mr. Mayfield promised himself a free afternoon when he would take his niece to a matinee and give her a little of the attention which he felt he had been rather chary of. The quiet house was the result of all this, and Ruth was actually less lonely than when the coming and going of visitors, whom she never saw, the bustle of entertainments in which she had no part, and the noisy clamor of Bertie stirred the household. "I think I'll take you down in the nursery now," she said to Hetty. "It's nice and warm there where the sunshine comes in the windows. I'll begin your new frock. Think of it, I have hardly looked at my box of pieces since I came. They will remind me of home so much. I shouldn't mind pulling out the stitches from old coats or doing anything, if I could only sit by Aunt Hester and hear Billy whistling in the woodshed. There's that striped pocket. I'll use that." Ruth unrolled the pocket. Something hard was in the bottom of it. She drew it out. She had forgotten the little wad of paper she had put there so long before. She pulled out the crumpled mass and began to smooth out the wrinkles. Something was written on the paper. She tried to read it, but the writing was too cramped and illegible for her childish powers. She could, however, make out the signature, which was in quite different handwriting. The letters, big and black, were easily read. SIMONPETTY, she spelled out. "I wonder what this is," she exclaimed. "I remember now I found it in the lining of the old coat. I think I will ask Martin if he can read it." She folded the paper and stowed it away in her box of pieces. Then, with Hetty carefully poised on her hand and the box under her arm, she went down to the nursery, where she devoted the rest of the afternoon to the making of a striped pink frock for her doll. At 5 o'clock, it was quite dark. The lights in the hall were lighted, and Katie came to turn them on in the nursery. Later, Martin appeared with Ruth's supper on a tray. At the sight of the lonely little figure, his dignity unbent. "Lonely here, miss? By yourself?" he said. "Oh, I am not so lonesome as if I didn't have Hetty, but I would like another little girl to play with. I wish you were a little girl, Martin." Martin chuckled as he set down the tray. "I can't say I quite echo your wish, miss. Cook made you a little cake just for yourself, and she said I was to tell you the cream toast was special good. Is there anything else you would care for, miss? Oysters or a bit of cold ham?" Ruth surveyed the tempting supper prepared for her. Cream toast, broiled chicken, a small pot of cocoa, a fresh sponge cake scalloped and with a hole in the middle, into which hole Martin had stuck a bunch of violets. Amber jelly and some fruit completed the bill of fare. Wouldn't Billy's eyes open if he could see all this served on beautiful cut glass and china? The thought of Billy reminded Ruth of the paper she had found in the pocket. "There is only one thing I want, Martin," she said. "I wish you would read something for me." She brought out the piece of paper and unfolded it before Martin. He screwed up his eyes, put his head to one side, and scrutinized the paper carefully, turning it over to look at the reverse side. "I can make out the Simon Petty," said Ruth by way of encouragement. Martin nodded. "Yes, miss, that's plain enough. 'Tain't a very good plain fist, the rest of it, but as I make out, it's a receipt signed Simon Petty." "What's a receipt?" asked Ruth quickly. "It's to tell that some money has been paid. This here." He pointed to the paper. "Seems to say that Frances Blackberry, or some such name, has paid Petty $5,000. Payment in full of money advanced. It reads like that." "Couldn't it be Frances Brackenberry?" "Are you sure it's Blackberry?" said Ruth eagerly. "Come to look at it, I guess it might be Brackenberry, but it's such twistified sort of writing it's hard to tell, but I guess you are right. And it's Brackenberry." "He did pay it, he did," said Ruth excitedly. "Aunt Hester said so. You know the parties, then? How did you happen to get hold of this?" "I found it in an old overcoat pocket. Aunt Hester ripped up the coat, and I was picking out the Indians, the stitches, you know, and I forgot, and stuck this in the pocket after I found it way down in a corner of the coat, between the cloth and the lining. I was going to make a frock for Hetty out of the pocket." "Oh, Martin, do you suppose it is worth anything?" Martin scratched his head. "I ain't much of a lawyer, but it might be worth keeping, or it may be an old paper that nobody cares anything about. It might save a heap of trouble in case this here Blackberry died and Simon Petty was mean enough to claim his debt." "Not Blackberry, Martin," said Ruth reproachfully. "Well, never mind the name. You know, sometimes when a man dies, there's claimants comes forward for money that's been paid, and if he's a married man and his relic ain't got any receipt to show, why, it makes trouble." "What's a relic? It has something to do with war, hasn't it?" "There is war relics, but this kind is a man's widow, the wife he leaves behind him. Suppose he doesn't leave any? Then he has heirs, sons or daughters, maybe. Major Brackenberry had a daughter, and she's my Aunt Hester. You'd better send this to her, then. It might save paying out $5,000 a second time." "Is $5,000 much money?" "It would buy a pretty good house in some places. But your supper is getting cold, miss." "Oh, well, I'll eat it. Thank you ever so much, Martin, for telling me all about the receipt. Tell Maria I am much obliged for the cake. It is so brown and lovely, and thank whoever put the dear little bunch of violets in the middle. You may go now, Martin." She spoke in the little superior way in which Mrs. Mayfield gave her orders, and Martin smiled. "It's a little lady," he said to the cook. "She didn't forget the thank you to send you, and was as pleased as Punch at the cake and flowers. She's a high and mighty way, too, when she needs it, and that's what a lady should have." Much as Ruth enjoyed her supper, she would have given more thought to it if she had not been so concerned about the receipt. She would send it to Miss Hester, or, no, if she could only know whether it meant that they could really go back to the big house, or that it would give enough to Miss Hester to allow of her taking Ruth back into her home. How quickly would the child hasten there? It would be a fine opportunity just now. If only Dr. Peasley were here for her to consult. He had told her before she left Springdale that if ever she needed advice or help to write to him. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll write to him this very evening and get Martin to mail the letter for me." She set to work as soon as her supper was over and managed a tolerably fair page to send to the doctor. The spelling was not so good as the handwriting, for the latter was something upon which Ruth prided herself. "Dear Doctor," she wrote, "I found a receipt signed Simon Petty. I am going to send it to you, but if you are coming to the city soon perhaps, I'd better keep it till you come. I am very well, and so is Hetty. We had supper together, and there were violets in the cake. If you had been here, I would have given you some. Hetty sends her love to you. Your loving friend, Ruth Henrietta Brackenberry. P.S. Don't tell Aunt Hester about the receipt till we know more about it. She might be awfully disappointed if it should turn out not to be good. Wouldn't it be nice if it would get us all back in the big house?" It was rather a vague letter, but might have had its effect if the doctor had been at home when it arrived. He had gone to a convention, however, and, as he expected to return in a couple of days, he had ordered his mail to be held at home for him. Ruth waited 1, 2, 3 days. Then she took alarm. Suppose the letter had been lost. She knew such things did sometimes occur. "I am glad I didn't send the receipt," she said to herself. The child was growing very lonely. Her longing for love and companionship was waxing greater and greater. There was no sign of Mr. Mayfield's immediate return. He had sent a brief note to Martin, saying that he was still detained by business. Mademoiselle was lingering, making the most of her holiday, and the days seemed very long to Ruth. She went to drive in state sometimes, or Katie took her for a walk. But it was cold weather to be sitting in squares where she fain would have tarried in the summertime. And so, the longing to see Aunt Hester and Billy, Lucia and Annie, Dr. Peasley and all her well-tried friends grew stronger each day. And at the end of the week, she had made her plans and had revealed them to Martin, who, solemn and stiff enough in his office as butler, had nevertheless a warm heart, and did his best to cheer the loneliness of the little girl. "How much does it cost to go to Springdale?" she asked him one afternoon. "I don't exactly know, miss," was the reply, "but I can easy find out. I'll look it up this evening. I've got to go out before supper." And so, when he brought up Ruth's supper to the nursery, Martin told her that a ticket would cost a matter of $4. Ruth counted out her store. "I have that much," she said, "and a little over. Oh, Martin, couldn't you put me on the train for Springdale?" Why, what's this, miss?" "You know about that receipt. I wrote to Dr. Peasley, and he hasn't answered the letter, so I'm afraid he didn't get it. And I have been thinking how dreadful it would be if I should mail the receipt, and it should get lost. So it seems to me I had better take it." She paused a moment, then said wistfully, "And besides, Martin, I do so want to see Aunt Hester and Billy and all of them. I feel as if I couldn't stand it. You know, if the receipt is all right, I should go back anyhow. I don't believe anyone here would miss me very much, and I know they miss me there." "Dear me, miss," said Martin. "I'm sure I should miss you mighty much." "Thank you, Martin. You always say kind things, and I wish you lived in Springdale instead of here." "I can't say I wish that, but I shouldn't mind going there for a visit of a day. I've an old friend from England who has a shop there, and I've promised to go to see him for many a long day." "Oh, I wish you would go. I think it is very nice that you have a friend there." "I wonder if I know him." "What is his name, Martin?" "John Fox, miss, and he keeps a green grocer shop." "I think I know just who he is," said Ruth in a pleased tone. "You see, Martin, I am really here only on a visit. I said that always, and that if ever something fine should happen, I would go straight back to Aunt Hester. Maybe this receipt is just like finding money, and oh, how I should love to surprise them and be the one to take the receipt to Aunt Hester." Martin stood with the carafe of water in his hand. He seemed to be thinking deeply. "Do you think Uncle would mind very much?" Ruth asked. "I know Aunt Lily wouldn't, and when I splained about the receipt, it would be all right, wouldn't it, Martin?" "I think so, miss. I'll have to think it over. I could get off for a couple days as well as not," he said, half to himself. "James would see to things, I suppose. I'll speak to Katie when I go down," he said to Ruth. "I think perhaps Mr. Mayfield wouldn't mind if I took you there myself and brought you back." "Oh, but—" Ruth began to say that maybe she would not come back, but she thought better of it. So she hastened to say, "I think you are as good as you can be, Martin." In a little while, Katie came up saying, "Martin tells me you and him is going on a lark. Well, I don't blame you, and I don't believe, but what your uncle would like you to have a little change. What shall you want to take with you? I'll pack enough to last you for 2 or 3 days." "I shall want to take Hetty," said Ruth. "Of course. You'll be going tomorrow, Martin says, for Mr. Mayfield likely comes bank the first of the week." "Oh, Katie, I am so happy. Tomorrow I shall see them all. I want to go to bed very early so that morning will come soon." "We'll go up and get you packed then," said Katie, "and you'll have a good time, I'm sure. Faith, it's stupid enough for a child like you to be shut off from comrades of your own age. She'd never take the trouble to be findin' playmates for you," she added, contemptuously. Ruth knew well enough who the she meant, but she made no comment. What was Aunt Lily to her now that she was to see Aunt Hester? She went to sleep and once laughed out loud because she dreamed that Stray, dressed up in Martin's livery, was taking her to see Dr. Peasley. Chapter 12. A Journey. Although Ruth had still a very vague idea of the meaning of a receipt, she was still sufficiently impressed with its importance to hold to it very tenaciously, and she carried it securely folded in a little old-fashioned bead bag which had belonged to Henrietta, and which, in imitation of her Aunt Lily, she had asked Katie to fasten securely to her belt. It was a clear, cold winter's day. Katie had at first insisted upon dressing the child in her newer and more fashionable clothes, which Mrs. Mayfield had provided for her. But Ruth begged so earnestly to be allowed to wear the red coat and plaid poplin dress that Katie yielded, compromising by placing upon the little girl's head a pretty beaver hat with its plumes which, as she said, gave her a bit of style. Martin, shorn of his livery and in everyday clothes, lost some of his stateliness and looked an ordinary somebody. He rode on the box of the carriage with the coachman, while Ruth, inside, was driven to the railway station, her heart beating fast and her eyes bright with excitement. She put her hand confidently in Martin's when she was lifted from the carriage, and possessing himself of the valise in which Katie had packed Ruth's clothing, the butler took his way to the cars, smiling down at the child as he seated himself by her side. "Now, ain't this a frolic?" he said. I don't know when I would have got to see John Fox if it hadn't been for you, and now here I'm traveling off to Springdale with a young lady." The hours seemed long, but as she drew nearer and nearer to her destination and certain points along, the way began to look familiar. Ruth could scarcely restrain herself. She bobbed up and down in her seat, chattered like a magpie to Martin, and once in a while gave a little squeak of pleasure as some well-known landmark caught her attention. At the last stop before reaching Springdale, a portly gentleman entered the car where Ruth and her escort sat. As she caught sight of him, Ruth sprang to her feet with an exclamation of surprise and pleasure. "Dr. Peasley!" she cried in such shrill, excited tones that persons turned their heads to see and smiled when a little red-coated figure darted into the aisle and precipitated herself against the portly man with the humorous eyes and kind smile. "Why, Ruth, little Ruth," exclaimed the doctor. "Where under canopy did you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm going to Springdale. Martin is taking me." The doctor piloted her to a seat across the aisle from the one in which she had been sitting. "And who is Martin?" he asked. "He is Uncle Sidney's butler. There he is over there." She indicated Martin by a nod in his direction. "He is a nice man, a very nice man indeed," Ruth went on. "He looks much finer in his livery, and he is very stern and straight when he is in the dining room, though you wouldn't think it to see him now, when he looks just like anyone else." "But why is he taking you to Springdale?" asked the doctor. "Oh, because there wasn't anyone else to do it, and it was a good chance for him to go to see John Fox. Do you know John Fox? Uncle is away on business, and Aunt Lily has taken Bertie to Lakewood. Bertie is horrid, doctor. He broke my dear little mug that Billy gave me just because I wouldn't let him have Hetty to break up. Would you have given her to him?" "Hardly, I think, for that purpose." "He is a dreadfully spoiled child," said Ruth, sighing, "but Aunt Lily thought he might get ammonia or something because he had a cold, and she took him away. Then Mademoiselle wanted to go see a sick lady, so I stayed with Katie and Maria and Martin because I didn't want to go to Lakewood. Did you get my letter?" she asked suddenly. "Why, no," the doctor answered. "Have you been writing to me? Then that is a pleasure I have in store for me when I get home. You see, I have been away for several days. I am just getting back from a convention. I didn't think when I got on the train here at the junction that I should see you. What were you writing to me about? Anything in particular?" "Yes, about the receipt," replied Ruth. "What receipt?" Ruth fumbled in her bead bag and drew forth the paper. "This," she said. "I didn't want to send it to Aunt Hester till I knew whether it was worth anything. Martin says it is a receipt from—" She lowered her voice. "Simon Petty to Francis Brackenberry, only he will call it Blackberry. You know Uncle Sidney told them I was named Mayfield, and they don't know I am really Ruth Brackenberry." The doctor had taken the paper and was examining it carefully. "The rascal," Ruth heard him say under his breath. "The unmitigated scoundrel." "Is it worth anything?" asked Ruth anxiously. "I should say it was. Where on earth did you get it, Miss Mouse?" Then Ruth told him the whole story. He nodded approvingly from time to time. At the close of her tale, he put the receipt carefully away in his pocketbook. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Will it do Aunt Hester any good? Will it do her enough good for me to go back and live with her? Do you want to go so much?" "Oh, I do. I would never have gone away. Only Billy said it would be better for Aunt Hester, and she wouldn't have to work so hard." The doctor's arm went around the child, and he drew her close to him. "Bless the little old woman," he said. "Well, Miss Moose, I think, if I am not mistaken, it will mean that you can go back if you want to and if your uncle will consent, for this paper doesn't only mean that $5,000 have been paid, but that all claims Simon Petty has pretended to hold were settled long ago." "And can Aunt Hester have her house again?" "I think so." "Oh, good, good," "Is Simon Petty very mean?" she whispered. The doctor was silent, but he shook his head as if over the evil of the man. "He's a pretty sick mortal," the doctor told her, "and he has not long to live, but he will live long enough to set this matter straight, or my name is not Tom Peasley. Now you sit here. I want to go over to speak to your friend Martin." He left Ruth sitting by herself, a little song in her heart which presently broke forth very softly from her lips. "I'm going home, I'm going home. There's the church and there's the steeple. Soon I'll see all my good people. I'm going home, I'm going home." The train stopped. The doctor took Ruth by the hand. Martin followed with the baggage, and in another moment, the train was winding its way down the track, leaving Ruth and her friends on the platform of the station at Springdale. "You leave the little girl in my charge," said the doctor to Martin. "I will see her home. You will not have any too much time to hunt up your friends, and so we need not tax you further. Thank you, Martin, for your kindness to our little girl." He held out his hand and gave Martin's a hearty grip. "Thank you so much, Martin," said Ruth. "The doctor knows the way to my house and he can take me." "I'll come around for you tomorrow in time," said Martin as he bade the child goodbye. But Ruth did not heed. For her, there was no tomorrow, if it meant a return journey. She skipped along by the side of the doctor till they came in sight of the little brown house. Then the child's desire outran the doctor's pace. "Oh, would you mind if I went on?" she asked. "I can't stand it if I don't." The doctor loosed his clasp of her hand, and she sped like an arrow toward the house. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the latch of the gate. She heard a sharp, excited bark from Stray. It was a waste of time to knock at the front door, and she flew around to the kitchen, bursting and half laughing, half crying. "I've come back, I've come back," she cried. Stray precipitated himself upon her with joyful yelps of welcome. Billy stopped in his task of setting the table to rush forward, calling, "Aunt Hester, Aunt Hester, it's Ruth, it's Ruth." Then from the next room, a figure came swiftly, arms extended. Ruth flung herself into them, clasping Miss Hester's neck as if she would never let go. "Oh, Aunt Hester, she sobbed. "Nobody has kissed me since you did." My little girl," murmured Miss Hester, kissing and kissing her. "I have missed you so much." The sobs which Ruth had choked back broke forth then into a real fit of weeping. The love for which the little heart had been starving was here, and the child wept on Aunt Hester's shoulder, gasping out, "I can't help it, I can't help it. I am so glad." At this moment, there was a thundering knock at the front door, and Billy ran to open to the doctor, who cried out in his big voice, "Where's that little runaway? Great Caesar, but I never saw a mouse scamper to its hole faster than she. Hello, Billy boy, where are the others?" Aunt Hester, with wet eyes and a tremulous smile around her mouth, came forward. "Come in, Tom," she said. "How did you happen to bring back my little girl?" "Let her tell you. I just stopped to say howdy, then I'll be off. Come here, Ruth. I want to speak to you. Excuse secrets, Hetty." He drew Ruth to one side. "Don't say anything about the paper till you see me again. I'll be back later in the evening." Ruth nodded understandingly, and the doctor took his departure. Billy busied himself in laying another place and bustled about like one accustomed to such service as setting tables and preparing supper. At intervals, he gave out pieces of news. "Old Petty is awful sick. They say he can't live. Squirefield has got a new horse, a beauty, bay with one white stocking. Phil Reed's little dog is dead. Phil wanted to buy Stray, but me and Aunt Hester couldn't part with him. There's a new teacher at our school. He's a #1, I tell you?" And so on. Meanwhile, Miss Hester and Ruth sat with arms around each other. Ruth answering the many questions and finding it hard to keep back the fact of the receipt. "I say, you look like a howling swell in that hat," said the observant Billy. "Ain't you gonna take it off and stay a while?" "Maybe I'll stay forever," returned Ruth with a happy laugh. The simple little supper of porridge and milk was on the table when again a knock was heard at the door. Billy rushed to open and returned with a basket in his hand. "Did you order these, Aunt Hester?" he asked. "I ordered nothing," said Miss Hester in surprise. "It must be a mistake. There's a paper marked Miss Hester Brackenberry," said Billy. "I guess it is all right. The man's gone anyhow. Let's open the basket." "But Billy, it's bought and paid for. The man said so, and he said it was for you." Billy paused in the act of drawing forth packages. Miss Hester flushed, but did not forbid the unpacking of the basket. It held many dainties: a roasted chicken, a glass of jelly, fruit, crackers, cheese, and a delicious cake. "Let me see that paper," said Miss Hester. Billy handed it to her. There was the name plain enough, and on the other side of the paper was written, "In honor of Ruth's return." "It's Tom Peasley's doings," exclaimed Miss Hester. "There is no doing anything with him once he takes a notion." So a festal array there was on the supper table that night, and Ruth enjoyed her meal more than any she had consumed in the house of her uncle. The dishes were scarcely cleared away before Dr. Peasley returned, bringing Squire Field with him. The squire drew Ruth to his knee. "Little Ruth Brackenberry, tell us about this," he said, laying the receipt on the table. And Ruth told him her story. The squire turned to Miss Hester. "So, Hester," he said, "your father did pay off his debt to Simon Petty, $15,000 in all. Tom Peasley couldn't let me rest, but routed me from my supper table and said Simon might die before he acknowledged this. So he dragged me up there where we set matters right, in a jiffy, and this is yours. The old house goes back into your hands, and we may thank this little lady for her sense in keeping that paper." "But I was going to throw it away," declared Ruth in all honesty. "If I hadn't put it in the old pocket, it would be gone." "Ah, yes, but you didn't throw it away. That's just the point," said the squire, smiling. He handed the paper to Miss Hester, with others bearing the signature of Simon Petty. Miss Hester took them with trembling hands. It seemed too good to be true. "Now," she said, "I can press the government claim. It only needed a little money to do that. Will you undertake it, Squire?" "Why didn't you say before this that you did not press it because you had no lawyer's fee?" asked the squire sharply. "Didn't you know I would have taken the case on the chance of its coming out all right?" "I didn't want my business done in that way," said Miss Hester proudly. "Well, it will be put through now," returned the squire. "Get me the papers when you can, and I'll do my best to strike while the iron is hot. You'll be living in your own home yet, Hester." "And won't I too?" asked Ruth. "Don't you know, Aunt Hester, I said I was only going to make a visit. Must I go back?" "Not unless you want to," said Aunt Hester. Then the squire and the doctor went away, and the three left behind talked of the coming true of their old dream. The big house with the pillars would be Miss Hester's again. She would have enough to support herself and the children, and there would be no more buttonholes to make. True to his promise, Martin came the next day, but Miss Hester would not let Ruth go. "I will write to Mr. Mayfield," she said. She was not long in doing this, and as Mrs. Mayfield was by no means anxious that Ruth should make her home with her uncle, she persuaded him that it was best to leave Ruth with her adopted aunt. Mr. Mayfield came to Springdale to talk the matter over. He found Ruth so happy and so eager to remain where she was that he made no effort to take her away. He offered a certain sum to be paid yearly for her support, but Miss Hester refused proudly. "She is my adopted daughter," she said, She bears my name, and I am able to do for her as I would for my own." Therefore, Mr. Mayfield went away, determining that he would send Ruth a present once in a while, and that he would not lose sight of her. Lucia rushed over to welcome Ruth back, and the girls at school listened eagerly to her tales of her French governess and of her life in the city. "I don't see how you could give up all that," said some of them. Although Miss Hester tried to keep the affair of the receipt a secret, it was generally known that Simon Petty had behaved very badly and had tried to cheat Miss Hester out of all her patrimony. Nora, knowing this, tried to keep out of Ruth's way, but after her grandfather's death, the family left town. It was one bright, beautiful spring morning that the little brown house was deserted, and Miss Hester set up her belongings again in the house across the street. Birds were singing in the tall trees on the lawn, vines were in leaf, and flowers blossomed in the borders. "Isn't it a dear home?" said Ruth as she stood with Miss Hester on the porch, looking around them. "It's yours forever now, isn't it, Aunt Hester?" "Yes, dearie, and it will be yours too, as long as you live." "I think Hetty would like to go with me to see what Billy is doing," said Ruth, going into the house and bringing out her doll. "Shouldn't you think she would feel very much at home, Aunt Hester, when she lived here so long ago? She told me last night that it did seem good to get back again. I wonder if she misses my dear Henrietta. Do you miss your Henrietta, your little sister, Aunt Hester?" "I should miss her much more if I didn't have my little Ruth," returned Miss Hester. "You take her place, dear child, better than anyone else could do." Ruth smiled up at her. Then she walked down the broad path and around the house to where she heard Billy whistling cheerily. "It's great, ain't it?" said Billy as she came up. "Aunt Hester says I can keep chickens, and I'm making a coop for a hen I'm going to get from Fred Felton. I'm going to do some work for him to pay for it. He's no good doing anything with tools, and I told him I'd help him out and take my pay in stock. I'm going to try to get some eggs that way, too, and I'll set my hen and have some chickens. Then I'll get other chickens. This is a fine place to keep them. There's so much room they can have a chicken yard, and they won't get out to scratch up the flowers. Maybe if I am lucky with my chickens, I can save enough money to do something worthwhile after a time." Ruth sat down to watch the quick, direct strokes of his hammer as he drove the nails into his coop. "It will be too lovely to have chickens and flowers both," she said. "Shall you keep chickens, or will you have a store when you grow up, Billy?" "I can do both, maybe. I want to keep store more than ever." "I don't think I want to make buttonholes," returned Ruth, laughingly. "Oh, Billy, did you see this tree? It has names all cut on it. Here's Thomas Peasley and Hester Brackenbury, and under it is Henrietta Brackenbury. Ruth Henrietta Brackenbury. Billy, I'd like to see that there, too." "I'll cut it for you," said Billy, viewing his copy with a satisfied air. "And won't you cut Billy Beatty?" Billy shook his head. "No, sir. I don't want my name in any such place. Where I want it is on a sign over a store door. William Beatty and Company in gold letters. I'll cut that name now. Where do you want it?" "Right there under Henrietta's." Billy began his work in a businesslike way, Ruth watching him admiringly. When he had finished and had walked away with his tools, she glanced around to see that no one was looking, and then she touched her lips softly to each name. "That's for you, Dr. Peasley, because you are so good. That's for you, Aunt Hester, because I love you so. That's for you, little Henrietta, because if you hadn't died, maybe I wouldn't be here." She touched with her lips each letter of the name, which Billy had just rudely carved upon the rough bark. "That's for you, name," she continued, "because you are such a dear name." She folded her hands after this ceremony and stood looking up at the soft blue sky across which fleecy clouds were drifting. "You don't care, do you, Mama?" she whispered. "You would love Aunt Hester, too, because she loves me."